Welcome back to the ongoing investigation. If you've been following along with our recent deep dives, well, you know exactly where we are on this map.
Right.
And you know exactly why today is just such a critical juncture. For those of you tracking the timeline, today is Tuesday, March 3rd, 2026. And exactly one day ago, Donut Lab dropped what we are calling the second revelation.
It really is a revelation, yeah.
They released their brand new VTT High Temperature Discharge Report that specifically report VTT CR-001-426, and they dropped it alongside a corresponding I Do Not Believe video.
And honestly, it is not an overstatement to say this release just completely shifts the landscape of what we thought we knew.
Totally.
I mean, it challenges some assumptions, but more importantly, it provides incredibly strong probabilistic support for some of our most specific chemical suspicions.
Yeah, but I want to set the table before we get into the new numbers. We are operating under the assumption that you, the listener, are already up to speed on the foundational architecture we've uncovered. You know about the broader CT coding and Nordic nano network structure.
Right, we're not going back over that.
Exactly. You're familiar with the TSMC printer analogy, the idea that this network is basically licensing a master ink or nanopaste platform to various manufacturers. You remember the multi-formulation trilemma we unpacked? And you know about the 6 specific diagnostic fingerprints from the fast charge data.
The ones that pointed us toward a cobalt-free, nickel-rich cathode paired with a polymer composite solid-state electrolyte.
Yes, those exact ones. So we aren't going to relay those foundations today. We are building a house on top of them.
That's definitely the right approach. Our mission for this particular deep dive is it's highly focused. We need to hold our own feet to the fire and grade the prediction scorecard we laid out last time.
Oh, man, the scorecard.
Yeah, we have to. We need to dissect a massive, and I mean massive, new chemical fingerprint that just emerged in this latest VTT data. We also have to address a highly credible, honest counterargument from the battery engineering community regarding the fast charging claims.
Which is super important to cover.
Very important. And finally, we are going to look at a leaked German legal document that definitively explains why every single person inside this corporate network is acting with such extreme, almost Cold War level secrecy.
But before we pull that thread, I do want to do a quick tone check. Because things are getting incredibly heated out there in the EV and battery forums. Everything we are discussing today is outsider speculation.
100%.
We are looking at public data, we are reading the academic literature, and we are inferring the rest based on the physics of electrochemistry. We are standing on the outside of a very tall fence trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle where the people actually holding the box cover are, well, they're legally gagged.
It's an essential disclaimer.
Yeah.
As we'll see when we get into the specifics of that non-disclosure agreement later, the people inside this network, like the engineers at Donut Lab, the scientists at Sana, they are not blind to their own chemistry.
Right.
They know exactly what they have in those pouches. We are the ones reverse engineering the recipe from the exhaust fumes of their public marketing and selective data releases. So we have to maintain our humility here. Our hypotheses strongly fit the data, but they remain hypotheses.
Right. Let's keep that detective mindset front and center. So let's pull out our prediction scorecard. In our previous deep dive, we really stuck our necks out. We made very specific predictions about what Donut Lab would choose to release next from the VTT lab.
We did.
We ranked 5 possible topics. We had energy density as the highest likelihood, temperature range as moderate, cycle life as low moderate, safety or abuse testing as lower, and high rate discharge as the lowest.
And we just have to take the loss right out of the gate on our primary pick. We were wrong.
Yeah, we were.
They did not show energy density. They chose high temperature performance, which was sitting at number 2 on our probability list. We also didn't predict they would test an entirely different cell. The first VTT report was on a cell we now know was labeled DL3. This new high temperature report is focused on a cell labeled DL2.
I was genuinely surprised they didn't tackle the energy density question, considering that's where the loudest skepticism is coming from. But here is where I think our analysis actually held up beautifully. We made a meta prediction.
We did.
We explicitly stated that if they show temperature instead of energy density, it strongly implies that the energy density numbers are, quote, complicated. And that is exactly what happened. They completely sidestepped the mass question again.
Yeah, the absence of data is often as illuminating as the data itself. VTT did not put the DL2 cell on a scale. Or, more accurately, Donut Lab did not instruct VTT to publish the mass of the cell.
Exactly.
And if we look at the other predictions we actually nailed, we predicted the cell would perform significantly better hot. The new data confirms that spectacularly, showing a 10.5% capacity increase at 80 degrees Celsius.
Huge jump.
It is. We also predicted that if multiple cells were tested across these reports, we would see cell-to-cell variability, and we did. The DL2 cell from this report has a roughly 4.6% capacity gap compared to the DL3 cell from the first report.
I want to hover on that concept of the meta signal for a moment. When a company is managing a highly scrutinized rollout like this, every PR move is calculated. When you look at the fact that they chose to release high-temperature discharge data specifically, what is the underlying message Donut Lab is broadcasting to the industry?
The meta signal here is wonderfully analytical if you understand the underlying chemistry. By choosing to showcase high-temperature performance, Donut Lab is deliberately leaning into the exact performance dimension where polymer solid-state batteries naturally inherently excel.
Right, because heat is their friend.
Exactly. Polymer electrolytes absolutely love heat. Their internal resistance drops and their ionic conductivity improves dramatically as temperatures rise. Conversely, what are they delaying? They are avoiding energy density, which is where their 400 watt-hours per kilogram claims face the most intense mathematical skepticism.
Yeah, the math just doesn't easily add up there.
Right. And they're avoiding low-temperature performance, which is traditionally the Achilles heel of any polymer-based system.
It's a classic strategic reveal cadence. You lead with your dominant traits, you put your best foot forward to build narrative momentum, and you backload the data that requires a more nuanced explanation or, might actually show limitations.
Exactly.
And honestly, that strategy perfectly sets up what we actually found inside the new VTT data.
Let's get into the forensics of that report.
Yeah.
VTT CR000012426. The testing methodology clarifies the batch structure. There are now 3 confirmed cells in this specific VTT cohort, DL1, DL2, and DL3. The extreme fast charge cell from the first report was DL3. Today's high-temperature report focuses entirely on DL2.
And the headline numbers from DL2 are they are staggering. Let's walk through the baseline. At 20 degrees Celsius, which is standard room temperature, the cell delivered just under 25 amp hours. But then they bumped the climate chamber up to 80 degrees Celsius, let the cell soak in that heat so it was completely thermally saturated, and ran the discharge again. The cell delivered about 2.5 extra amp hours, settling right around 27.5.
Yeah.
That is a 10.5% capacity increase simply from heating the cell.
And this is where we have to connect the dots back to our diagnostic framework. Recall from our previous discussion, we identified 6 diagnostic fingerprints in the fast charge data that collectively pointed toward a polymer composite electrolyte.
Yep.
Well, this 10.5% capacity gain, this is the 7th fingerprint. And mathematically speaking, it is the strongest, most definitive behavioral signal we have seen yet.
I really want to dig into why that magnitude, that 10.5%, is such a screaming anomaly. If we look at standard liquid electrolytes, the kind of lithium-ion technology sitting in your driveway or in the phone in your pocket right now, they behave completely differently under heat.
Entirely differently.
If you take a conventional NMC liquid cell and heat it from 20 degrees to 60 degrees, you might eke out a tiny 2 to 5% capacity gain. The liquid solvent gets a bit less viscous, so the lithium ions move a bit freer. But you hit a hard wall.
A very hard wall.
Once you push past 60 degrees, you hit severe diminishing returns. And above 80 degrees, the cell physically starts to break down. You don't get a sudden 10.5% surge in power at 80 degrees with a liquid cell. It just breaks the bounds of known liquid behavior.
It doesn't just break the bounds, it operates on a different curve entirely. A 10.5% jump at 80 degrees is the textbook classical signature of thermally activated ionic conductivity.
Okay, break that down for us.
To understand why, we have to visualize the inside of a polymer electrolyte. In a polymer system, the polymer chains are relatively stiff and entangled at room temperature. Think of a dense, microscopic thicket of branches.
Like trying to walk through a really dense forest?
Exactly. They physically restrict the movement of the lithium ions trying to pass through. Because the ions can't move quickly enough through this thicket, they simply cannot reach all the active sites buried deep inside the thick cathode material before the voltage drops to the cutoff point.
So effectively, at room temperature, a significant chunk of the battery's potential energy is just sitting there, trapped. The battery is full, but the highway is so jammed that the cars can't get to the exit before the clock runs out.
That's a really great way to visualize it. But when you apply heat, when you push that environment to 80 degrees Celsius, you are literally waking up the polymer matrix. The heat increases the thermokinetic energy of the system. Those stiff polymer chains suddenly become highly flexible.
To start moving around.
Yeah, they start undulating. The thicket loosens up, and the ionic conductivity of the electrolyte shoots up by an order of magnitude. Suddenly, those lithium ions can easily rush through the polymer and permeate into the deepest, previously inaccessible parts of the cathode. The cell magically delivers more capacity because more of the actual physical cathode material is finally able to participate in the chemical reaction.
And the voltage curves published in the VTT report back this up beautifully. If you look at the graphs, the average operating voltage of the cell was notably higher during the 80-degree discharge compared to the 20-degree baseline. And higher voltage during discharge means the internal resistance, the impedance of the cell has plummeted.
Precisely. The voltage plateau physically rises on the chart because the electrolyte is no longer fighting the flow of ions.
Yeah.
Now, we must maintain our analytical discipline here.
Right.
This data is profoundly consistent with our hypothesis of a cross-linked polymer composite electrolyte. It fits our model like a glove, but we cannot say it outright proves it. The true molecular composition remains completely hidden behind the NDA.
Which brings up the elephant in the climate chamber. Being objective means we can't just cherry-pick the glorious 80-degree capacity jump. We have to talk about what happened when VTT pushed the cell even further, to the absolute edge.
The 100-degree test.
Yeah. They ran a discharge test at 100 degrees Celsius. The cell survived, it discharged successfully, and it continued to accept a normal charge afterward. But, and this is a big but, the VTT report specifically notes and even provides a rather dramatic photograph showing that the aluminum laminate pouch lost its vacuum. The battery swelled up like a balloon.
And this is where the interpretation of the data gets highly contested and where we have to engage in some very careful extrapolation. The central question the battery community is debating right now is this: was that swelling a physical failure of the packaging or a chemical failure of the battery inside?
Let's lay out the defense first.
Yeah.
What is the charitable interpretation of a puffy battery at 100 degrees?
The charitable interpretation focuses entirely on the wrapper. Standard aluminum laminate pouch cells, like the one tested here, use a polypropylene inner sealant layer. Polypropylene is the plastic that melts and fuses to seal the edges of the pouch.
Okay.
While pure polypropylene has a melting point around 160 degrees Celsius, its structural heat seal strength begins to degrade significantly at much lower temperatures, usually around 80 to 90 degrees. So if you hold that pouch at 100 degrees for several hours during a slow discharge test, that sealant layer becomes soft and pliable.
And once it softens, differential thermal expansion takes over. Any tiny amount of residual moisture or inert gas trapped inside the cell during manufacturing is going to expand dramatically at 100 degrees. The softened seal gives way, the laminate layers separate, and the pouch loses its vacuum. So, under this theory, the analogy is putting a sealed plastic bag full of water into a boiling pot. The plastic bag is going to warp, stretch, and eventually fail. But the water inside, the actual chemistry, is completely fine. It's purely a failure of the packaging material, not the active ingredients.
That is exactly the argument Donut Lab supporters are making. And to be fair, it is a highly plausible mechanical explanation. If the chemistry survived 100 degrees unharmed and only the soft pouch failed, then if Donut Lab or their manufacturing partner, Sana, eventually packages these exact same cells in rigid, hard prismatic cases, which Sana's marketing materials have heavily implied they will do, the chemistry might easily tolerate the 130 degrees they claim on their spec sheets.
But I'm going to play the skeptic here, because brushing off a swollen battery is dangerous territory. We have to bring in the perspective of Dr. Juho Heiska.
Yes, from Aalto University.
Right. He's a highly respected Finnish battery researcher. He specializes in organic battery materials and solid-state interface coatings. He runs the Accutatory deep dives. He took one look at that photograph of the swollen pouch and raised a massive, waving red flag.
And his skepticism is deeply rooted in the realities of cell degradation. Dr. Heiska points out that in battery diagnostics, pouch swelling is almost never just harmless thermal expansion. Pouch swelling typically indicates that gas was actively generated inside the cell.
Outgassing.
Yes, outgassing. We are talking about carbon dioxide, hydrogen, or light hydrocarbons that are the direct result of unwanted side reactions occurring in the electrolyte or at the electrode interfaces.
Right. At 100 degrees, even in a solid-state system, various materials can begin to break down. The polymer itself might start to degrade, or the binders that hold the cathode powders together might begin to decompose and release gas. And Dr. Heiska's specific pointed concern was the timeline of this swelling.
The 3 cycles.
Exactly. This cell puffed up after just 3 cycles at elevated temperatures. We aren't looking at a battery that swelled after a 1,000-cycle long-term endurance test. It swelled almost immediately upon being subjected to 100 degrees.
Which means it swelled at 100 degrees and continued to function is an incredible data point for thermal tolerance. But it is absolutely not the same thing as a clean pass. Gas generation changes the internal pressure dynamics of a cell. It can cause microdelamination between the solid electrode layers, increasing internal resistance over time and severely compromising long-term cycle life.
So it's not just a wrapper issue.
We cannot simply wave away the swelling as a melting plastic bag. The physics strongly suggest it very well could be the underlying chemistry groaning under the immense thermal stress.
But, and this is a massive but, even if Dr. Heiska is entirely correct and the polymer binder is outgassing and the cell is slowly damaging itself at 100 degrees, let's not lose sight of the vital takeaway for the listener here. The cell puffed up, it lost its vacuum, it might have even damaged its long-term lifespan, but it kept working, and more importantly, it did not catch fire.
This is the critical elimination filter. This is where the liquid electrolyte theory goes to die. Think about standard liquid electrolytes. They rely heavily on solvents like dimethyl carbonate. Dimethyl carbonate physically boils at roughly 90 degrees Celsius.
So if you have a liquid organic electrolyte cell, and you bake it at 100 degrees until the pouch seal physically breaches and loses vacuum, you have just introduced atmospheric oxygen into a chamber filled with highly flammable, vaporized, boiling solvents at extreme heat.
You've completed the fire triangle.
Oxygen, fuel, and heat. The result isn't a puffy battery that you can recharge. The result is catastrophic, violent thermal runaway.
Yeah, exactly. But we didn't get a fire. VTT plugged it back in and recharged it normally. That single fact functionally eliminates liquid organic electrolytes from the board entirely. You cannot have a standard liquid lithium-ion battery survive a 100-degree pouch breach without an event. The physics simply do not allow it.
So it has to be solid state.
Well, while the swelling might indicate imperfections in the solid-state formulation or gas generation from the binder, the absolute lack of a thermal event strongly confirms the core safety claim of the solid-state architecture.
Which is a perfect pivot point. Because while we are sitting here marveling at the thermal survival of this cell in a Finnish lab, the wider global battery engineering community is actively testing these claims in their own workshops. And a major piece of counter-evidence dropped recently from a YouTuber named Kyle Van Verden.
Yeah, his video.
He posted a video that directly challenged the foundational framing of Donut Lab's first fast charge release.
And we need to give this counter-argument oxygen.
Oh.
We need skeptics like Kyle to keep the analysis honest and rigorous. Kyle set out to test the claim that a conventional NMC cell, nickel manganese cobalt, cannot handle an 11C charge rate.
Okay, walk us through his test.
So he took a 6-amp-hour Sunwoda NMC pouch cell. He sandwiched it tightly between 2 aluminum cooling plates to manage the thermals, and he blasted it with an 11C charge rate, which is, of course, the exact same C-rate Donut Lab showed in their first VTT report.
Just to refresh the terminology for anyone newer to the space, 11C means the charge current is 11 times the total capacity of the battery. So if it's a 6-amp-hour battery, he's shoving 66 amps of current into it. It's an aggressive, punishing speed.
Very punishing.
And the results Kyle got were stunning. The prevailing narrative from Donut Lab, and frankly the narrative we explored in our own analysis, was that conventional NMC cells simply can't do 11C without generating massive, cell-destroying amounts of internal heat. But Kyle did it, and his liquid NMC Sunwoda cell reached a peak temperature of only 29 degrees Celsius.
29 degrees, barely above room temperature. Let's put that in context with the VTT data. In the first VTT report, the Donut Lab DL3 cell was charged at 11C with single heat sink attached, and it reached a scorching 89 degrees Celsius.
Wow.
Kyle's liquid cell stayed an incredible 60 degrees cooler at the exact same relative charging speed. He looked right at the camera, addressed the CEO of Donut Lab, and said, "This is an NMC cell that warmed up maybe 1 degree at 11C.
So I'm going to push back on our own theories here. Doesn't Kyle's test blow a massive hole in the solid-state hypothesis? If a standard liquid NMC cell can take an 11C charge and still perfectly cool, doesn't that prove Donut Lab could just have a well-cooled, regular liquid battery behind the curtain? I mean, are we chasing ghosts?
It is a brilliant test, and we must acknowledge fairly that Kyle is absolutely right about his core premise. Demonstrating 11C fast charging capability in isolation does not prove a battery is solid state. A highly optimized, well-cooled liquid cell can absolutely hit that speed.
Okay.
However, we have to dissect the massive fundamental mismatch in the test conditions. It all comes back to the battery trilemma we discussed last time. You have to balance energy density, power density, and cycle life. You rarely get all three.
Right. All cells are not created equal. Explain the structural difference between the sun-water cell Kyle used and the DL3 cell VTT tested.
The sun-water cell Kyle used is a 6 amp-hour cell that is explicitly power optimized. It is manufactured with incredibly thin electrodes. Thin electrodes are designed specifically to dump and absorb current rapidly, mostly for hybrid vehicle applications or power tools, where you need quick, short bursts of energy.
So the ions don't have far to travel.
Exactly. The internal pathways for the lithium ions are very short. The Donut Lab cell, on the other hand, is a 26 amp-hour cell. It claims to be energy density optimized. They are shooting for a massive 400 watt-hours per kilogram. To achieve high energy density, physics dictates that you must build thick electrodes to pack in as much active material as possible.
It's the Formula One tire versus the heavy-duty semi-truck tire analogy.
Right.
Kyle's taking a highly specialized, thin Formula One tire that is designed exclusively to grip corners at 200 miles an hour, and he's holding it up saying, look, tires can do this, it's not a big deal.
Yes.
Meanwhile, Donut Lab is trying to build a massive heavy-duty touring tire for an 18-wheeler that also, miraculously, grips the road like an F1 tire. Thick electrodes inherently have longer pathways for the ions to travel. They have higher internal resistance, especially when you shove current into them at high C rates. They generate more heat.
Precisely. And if we connect this structural reality to the broader diagnostic picture, the supreme irony of Kyle's test is that the massive 89-degree versus 29-degree temperature gap actually supports the polymer solid-state hypothesis.
Wait, hold on. You're trying to tell me that the Donut Lab cell almost boiling itself at 89 degrees is actually a good thing for their solid-state claims? That sounds like a massive reach. How does generating extreme heat prove anything other than inefficiency?
It points directly to the nature of their internal resistance. Why did the Donut Lab cell hit nearly 90 degrees? Because it was fighting massive internal resistance at room temperature. If you look at the fast charge data, there is a spike of nearly 200 watts of peak heat generation at the very start of the charge.
Which is huge.
It is. That is the cell violently struggling to push lithium ion through a stiff, unyielding polymer matrix at room temperature. As the cells self-heated, the polymer woke up, that resistance dropped, and it smoothly accepted the rest of the charge. Kyle's liquid cell didn't eat up because liquid electrolytes have incredibly high ionic conductivity at room temperature. There was no bottleneck. The ions flowed effortlessly from second one.
So Kyle's incredibly cool running cell behaved exactly like a thin electrode liquid battery should behave. And Donut Lab's hot running cell behaved exactly like a thick electrode polymer solid-state battery should behave.
Correct. Furthermore, in investigative analysis, the cumulative elimination filter is what truly matters. As we just agreed, 11C charging alone doesn't prove solid state. But 11C charging plus a massive 10.5% capacity gain at 80 degrees plus a 100-degree pouch breach with no fire.
Right, you have to stack them.
When you stack those three distinct data points together, Kyle's liquid sun-water cell gets forcefully eliminated from the board by the second and third filters. The data points act cumulatively. You cannot evaluate the fast-charging heat in a vacuum. You have to evaluate it alongside the high-temperature survival.
Okay, so the electrochemistry is holding up under scrutiny. The chemical fingerprints are pointing relentlessly in a very specific cross-linked polymer direction. But that brings us to the giant, legally binding elephant in the room.
The NDA.
Yeah. If this technology is so revolutionary, if the physics are this sound, why is the company acting like a Cold War intelligence agency? Why is the CEO dodging basic, direct questions about where their factory is located? Why is the prestigious VTT lab forced to describe the cell in their official reports as identified by the customer as solid state instead of just throwing it under a microscope and telling us what's in it?
That brings us to the Rosetta Stone of this entire investigation. We need to talk about the non-disclosure agreement.
We managed to obtain the standard non-disclosure agreement issued by CT Coding AG. This is the master document originating from Cantering 36 in Königswinter, Germany. This is the foundational contract that anyone, whether you are an investor, a manufacturing partner, a lab technician, or a licensee, must sign before you get a single look under the hood of this technology.
And when you sit down and read the specific legal clauses in this document, the bizarre, opaque, highly defensive behavior of Donut Lab, Sana, holy volt, and all the other nodes in this network suddenly makes perfect rational sense.
Let's read through the hits, because this document is wild. First off, it explicitly covers the nanopaste. The language protects any, and I quote, activator, additive binder formulation, mixture, nanoparticle paste, recipe, or slurry related to energy storage. It is an ironclad lock on the chemistry itself. But here's the crazy part. Section 4.3, the survival clause.
Yes, the confidentiality obligations survive the termination of the agreement, perpetually.
Forever. It's not a standard 5-year lockup. It's not a clause that says confidentiality expires once the product launches commercially. If you sign this NDA, you can never, ever talk about the recipe. Even if Donut Lab gets angry and cuts all ties with CT Coding tomorrow, their engineers are legally gagged for the rest of their natural lives.
It entirely explains the historical void. It explains why 14 years of research and development by the inventor, Ernst Tolsenbein, yielded virtually zero public scientific information, no peer-reviewed papers, no public presentations. CT Coding controls the disclosure timeline with an iron grip.
They control everything.
They do. It also explains why VTT tests a black box. Section 2.2 of the NDA explicitly prohibits reverse engineering the technology. Donut Lab cannot give VTT permission to chemically analyze the paste because Donut Lab doesn't actually own the core IP. They just license it. VTT is contractually forbidden from looking inside.
But the most aggressive clause, the one that really made my jaw drop and made me realize the genius of this business structure, is Section 2.7, the improvement trap.
Yes. Section 2.7 stipulates that any improvements made to the technology by the recipient automatically, legally, belong to CT Coding AG.
Okay, I want you, the listener, to really imagine how frustrating this scenario would be in the real world. Imagine you buy $1 million state-of-the-art bakery oven, and the manufacturer gives you their top secret chocolate chip cookie recipe to use in it. You spend months in your kitchen tweaking it, you do the hard work, you figure out that adding a pinch of sea salt and baking it at a slightly higher temperature makes it the greatest cookie in the world.
The perfect cookie.
Right. But according to Section 2.7, you don't own that new recipe. You have to legally assign the ownership of your sea salt improvement back to the oven manufacturer in Germany.
It is a brilliantly ruthless, centralized business model. CT Coding sits at the center of a hub-and-spoke network. Donut Lab in Finland, Sana in Spain, CLM in the Netherlands, they're all out on the spokes doing the grueling, incredibly expensive work of scaling this paste up to commercial production.
They take all the risk.
Yeah, they are the ones optimizing the curing times, they are tweaking the formulations for local climates, they are solving the million little engineering nightmares that come with mass manufacturing, and every single breakthrough they make flows straight back up the spoke to Germany. CT Coding gets smarter, and its IP portfolio gets richer, funded entirely by the sweat equity of its licensees.
It's incredible. It's essentially crowdsourcing your R&D while retaining 100% of the ownership. But what does this mean for our analysis? Does this mean Donut Lab has no idea what they are actually selling? Are they just blindly printing a paste they don't understand?
No, and this is a vital distinction to make. The NDA creates a one-way mirror. Donut Lab and the other licensees do know the real composition of their cells. You sign the NDA precisely so you can receive the confidential information to calibrate your machinery. They know the chemical formulation, they know the ratios, they are not blind, but they're legally gagged from telling the public.
So internally, they can verify all these claims. They know exactly if it has cobalt or lithium, or if it's pure polymer, or if it's some hybrid gel. They know if our 6 fingerprints are right. They just can't tweet about it.
Exactly. And this structural reality forces us to stay incredibly humble in our analysis. We are out here positing that this is a cobalt-free, nickel-rich cathode paired with a cross-linked polymer composite.
Yeah.
Even if our outside hypothesis is 100% perfectly accurate down to the molecular level, Donut Lab cannot confirm it.
They can't just nod their heads.
No, they cannot reply to a comment saying, "You guessed it." And conversely, if we are totally laughably wrong, they cannot correct us without risking a breach of contract. The NDA legally prevents them from engaging with our analysis.
Which means the profound silence we are interpreting as shady or evasive is actually just contractually obligated. But there is a loophole, right? A public domain exception in international IP law.
Yes. The NDA acknowledges that information entering the public domain by legitimate, independent means is no longer confidential, but it has a precision lock on it. The contract states that just because individual ingredients are known, that doesn't mean the compilation or the recipe is public.
Ah, clever.
So even if we, as independent analysts, figure out the cell contains lithium and polymer and nickel, We don't know the exact ratios, the mixing speeds, or the specific UV curing frequencies. The secret sauce remains protected.
But speaking of information leaking out into the public domain, that brings us to one of the most entertaining parts of this entire saga. Because despite this ironclad German NDA, despite all the secrecy, Donut Lab made a massive, unforced editing slip-up in their March 2nd release.
It was an extraordinary error in document control. In the I Don't Believe video, during the technical walkthrough where they're standing in the VTT lab with Vilpipipo, they show a graphic on screen of the VTT Report's introduction page. And the text on that video graphic clearly says, one cell was subjected to charge performance tests and another cell was subjected to low-temperature discharge tests reported separately.
Low-temperature discharge tests, it's right there in black and white on the video. But if you go to Donut Lab's website right now and download the actual PDF of the report, that sentence is completely gone. It just says high-temperature discharge tests.
If you look at the document metadata, the narrative becomes clear. The report was initially drafted by VTT on February 27th. But the final digital signature wasn't applied until March 2nd at 9:38 a.m., just hours before the video was scheduled to go live at 15:00 finish time.
Oh, man.
This timeline suggests a frantic, last-minute decision by Donut Lab to redact the mention of the cold test from the downloadable PDF. But the video was already fully rendered, edited, approved, and likely uploaded to YouTube servers. They couldn't change the graphic in the video in time. The video preserved the original, unredacted truth.
The internet is undefeated, so it proves that DL1, the mysterious through cell sitting in the VTT climate chamber, is the cold test cell. And it proves that the low-temperature data either already exists in a folder at VTT or is actively being generated right now as we speak.
This is the most crucial missing piece of the puzzle. We talked about elimination filters earlier. Because the hot test effectively eliminated liquid electrolytes, the cold end of the spectrum is the ultimate decisive discriminator for polymer systems. This is where we lay down a hard, mathematically falsifiable prediction.
Let's put our money where our mouth is. What exactly happens when you freeze a polymer solid-state battery?
If this cell is indeed a cross-linked polymer composite, as all our chemical fingerprints suggest, our firm prediction is a massive 40 to 60% capacity loss at negative 30 degrees Celsius.
40 to 60%. That is a massive hit. If I lose half my range in the winter, I'm not buying that car. Why is the drop-off so severe?
Because the very thing that makes the polymer incredible at 80 degrees makes it terrible at negative 30 degrees. The polymer matrix acts as a physical bottleneck when it freezes. At negative 30 degrees, the thermal kinetic energy is so incredibly low that the flexible polymer chains stiffen up and essentially lock into place.
The thicket freezes solid.
Yes, the lithium ions can barely move through the thicket. The only thing allowing the cell to function at all, the only thing preventing a total freeze, would be the ceramic filler particles embedded in the composite, providing a partial, highly sluggish pathway for the ions. The cell will limp along, it will produce power, but it will struggle mightily against its own internal resistance.
To give the listeners some context on how hard this problem is to solve, how does the only other widely deployed commercial polymer battery in the world handle extreme cold?
You're referring to the Bolloré LMP battery, lithium metal polymer. It has been in commercial use since 2011, and how does it handle the cold? It handles it by completely giving up. A standard Bolloré polymer battery completely crystallizes and freezes solid at room temperature, let alone at negative 30 degrees.
Wow.
It requires internal heating elements that run 24/7, pulling power from the grid or the battery itself to keep the core at 60 degrees Celsius, just so the vehicle can function. The Autolib car-sharing fleet in Paris famously used these batteries. The irony was that these green electric cars had to be plugged into the grid constantly when parked, just to keep their batteries from freezing into solid bricks.
So if Donut Lab's DL1 cell manages to retain, say, better than 80% of its capacity at negative 30 degrees without an external heater,
then they have achieved an absolutely unprecedented, Nobel-level scientific breakthrough in polymer chemistry. They will have solved a problem that has eluded multi-billion-dollar corporations and thousands of PhDs for 3 decades. Or our entire analytical hypothesis is fundamentally flawed, and they have some sort of exotic, quasi-solid or gel system we haven't even anticipated.
And what if the retention is somewhat mediocre, say around 70% at negative 20 degrees?
That specific thermal profile would look suspiciously like a sodium-ion battery. The prominent battery analyst Da Vinci has heavily championed the sodium-ion hypothesis for this network. Sodium-ion performs respectably in mild cold, dropping to about 70% capacity at -20 degrees.
Okay, but
However, we have to look at the whole board. The 4.15-volt standard charge limit we've seen in both VTT reports strongly contradicts current sodium-ion technology, which typically degrades rapidly if pushed above 4.0 volts. The upcoming cold test will force a final resolution between these competing theories.
okay, I want to zoom out from the chemistry lab for a moment and look at the broader business strategy. Because Donut Lab's extreme opacity and their tendency to mash all their best numbers together into one spec sheet is drawing a lot of fire from industry veterans. How does this strategy compare to how the established giant players handle new tech rollouts? Let's look at BYD as a baseline.
BYD is the perfect foil here. BYD is massive, and they're actively developing multiple next-generation battery chemistries simultaneously. They have a sulfide solid-state track they're developing for their premium vehicles, aiming for high targets like 400 watt-hours per kilogram and 5C charging.
Right.
And they have a completely separate sodium-ion track for their entry-level mass-market vehicles, aiming for much lower cost, but explicitly sacrificing energy density to get there.
So BYD has a multi-formulation strategy, which is exactly what we hypothesized CT Coding has with their customizable printer platform. They can print high-energy paste for one client and high-power paste for another.
Exactly. The underlying manufacturing logic is identical. Use different specific chemistries for different specific applications, but the transparency and communication strategy is entirely different. BYD cleanly, meticulously separates their specifications in their investor briefings. They say, this is the solid-state cell, it costs more, it does X. This is the sodium cell, it's cheap, it does Y. And they are brutally honest about mass production timelines, targeting around 2030 for their true solid-state rollout.
Whereas Donut Lab takes 400 watt-hours per kilogram from one potential energy cell, 11C fast charging from the VTT test cell we just saw, and maybe a 100,000 cycle lifespan from some organic cathode cell they tested 5 years ago, and they aggregate all those disparate numbers under a single V1 product label.
Which is confusing.
It creates a Frankenstein spec sheet that looks physically impossible to achieve in a single cell, which is exactly what invites the scam accusations from engineers who know you can't have your cake and eat it too.
And we don't frame this as an accusation against Donut Lab, but as an instructive contrast in corporate communications. The technical opacity is forced by the German NDA, but the marketing aggregation, the decision to blend the specs, is a choice. But we don't even need to look as far as BYD in China to see a different approach. We can look right inside the CT coding network itself. Look at CLM Nano Energy in the Netherlands.
Right. This is fascinating. CLM is using the exact same nanopaste platform originating from Germany. They are essentially Donut Lab's corporate sibling on a different spoke of the hub. But their approach is literally the exact opposite of what we are seeing in Finland.
CLM Nano Energy has been completely, remarkably silent publicly. They aren't dropping viral YouTube videos. They aren't commissioning highly specific narrow tests from local labs. Their website explicitly states that detailed cell specifications are only shared under NDA and only after the completion of rigorous SGS and TUV certification programs, which are scheduled for early 2026.
For those who don't work in European manufacturing, SGS and TUV are the absolute gold standard independent testing bodies. When you take a product to them, you don't get to hand them a menu of what you want tested. The certifier defines the protocol. They stress test the battery to grueling industry safety and performance standards, not to tailored marketing standards.
That is the crucial difference. Dr. Heiske, our skeptical Finnish battery researcher, has explicitly stated he won't believe any Donut Lab Commission report because Donut Lab gets to define the test parameters. SGS and TUV represent the fully independent testing that the hard skeptics demand. So we have two companies built on the exact same technology platform, bound by the exact same NDA. One goes fast, public and aggressive. The other goes slow, silent, and institutional. It will be fascinating to see which strategy yields better commercial adoption in 12 months.
Which brings us to the ultimate reckoning. Because all the lab tests, all the German NDAs, all the YouTube arguments and Reddit threads are about to crash headfirst into reality. The theoretical phase is ending.
Yes. We have to talk about the actual physical product, the Verge TS Pro motorcycle.
At the Consumer Electronics Show in January 2026, Tuomo Lehtimäki, the leadership at Verge, confirmed on the record that the manufacturing switchover from conventional monocell cylindrical liquid cells to these new solid-state batteries happened in November 2025. They are physically building the bikes on the assembly line right now, and the first customer deliveries are slated for April 2026.
This is the moment of truth. CT Coding's entire business model, 14 years of secrecy, relies on that ironclad, perpetual NDA binding their corporate partners. Donut Lab can't talk. Santa can't talk. VTT is contractually blocked from looking inside the black box.
But you know who absolutely does not sign a perpetual German non-disclosure agreement? A paying customer who just bought a motorcycle.
Precisely. The moment those motorcycles hit the streets of Helsinki and Tampere, the dam breaks. Real-world, uncontrollable data is going to flood Reddit, YouTube, and the EV forums. Riders will test the cold starts after leaving the bike outside in a freezing Finnish night. They will test the fast charging at public DC fast chargers. They will calculate the real-world range based on actual highway driving, not climate chamber math. No lab report can artificially inflate physical performance once it's in the wild, and no NDA can stop a rider from posting their range data.
So to summarize the incredible journey of today's analysis, we saw a battery gain 10.5% capacity at 80 degrees, a massive behavioral signature that practically screams thermally activated polymer solid state.
Yeah.
We addressed Kyle Van Verden's 11C liquid cell test, acknowledging that fast charging alone isn't proof, but pointing out that surviving 100 degrees without a fire is the true elimination filter. We caught a leaked video graphic proving cold test data is actively being hidden or prepared, and we read the German NDA that legally enforces the deafening silence across this entire multinational corporate network.
And we are officially on the clock. If you go to Donut Lab's website right now, there is a countdown timer ticking down to Monday, March 9th, 2026 at 15:00 finish time. The DL1 low temperature data is coming. We will soon see if our 40 to 60% capacity loss prediction holds true, or if they have defied the laws of polymer physics.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with this final provocative thought to chew on. CT Coding has spent 14 years meticulously building an intellectual property empire completely shrouded in secrecy. They protected it with Section 2.7 of a German contract that forces everyone to stay quiet and surrender their innovations. But what happens to that empire the very minute an independent electrical engineer buys a Verge TS Pro off the lot in April?
That's the billion-dollar question.
What happens when they roll it into a garage, crack open that battery pack with a hacksaw, scrape out the nanopaste, run it through a mass spectrometer, and publish the exact chemical recipe on the internet for the whole world to see? The NDA binds the corporate partners, but it cannot bind the public. The countdown to April is the countdown to the truth. We'll see you back here next time.